A Lady and Her Husband by Amber Reeves. Chapter 6. Mary woke next morning to a feeling of uneasiness, so that she knew, before she could remember why, that she must brace herself to meet a disagreeable day. Then the sight of her maid, trim and composed, looping back her window curtains, reminded her of Laurie's letter. That was bad enough, but she soon realized that she could only turn from it to other anxieties. What had happened to the poor pretty child? What was James thinking, and what was Mary herself going to say to Miss Percival? She tried to dismiss this last annoyance by telling herself that she was a coward. Miss Percival, as a secretary, could not seem curious about what her employers, in their Olympian privacy, had said to one another, and she must necessarily put the best face on what she was told. But this was small relief to Mary, who had so little need to dread harsh words that she had trained herself to reckon with thoughts. She now felt the weight of Miss Percival's private disappointment more severely than that lady seemed likely to feel it for herself. But after all, this was nothing compared to her disloyalty to James. She had pretended that she did not hear James when he opened her door last night, and he had gone away, believing that she was asleep. She dressed quickly now to avoid meeting James in her own room. In the dining room, she would be better able to persuade herself that she hadn't practically deceived him. Keeping back Florrie's letter, she did not consider deceit. She was accustomed to use her judgment in the matter of shielding James from worry, but the other affected their emotional relations. In the dining room, she found Rosemary unexpectedly in time for breakfast. It was one of Rosemary's charming gifts that she could saunter downstairs at noon with the air of dewy freshness proper to an Arcadian milkmaid. Trent was there too, for Trent counterbalanced his sister's masculine carelessness of time by a beautiful punctuality. Their presence shielded Mary from the affection which James, had they been by themselves, would certainly have shown. After her first relief, it seemed terrible to Mary that she should be thus welcoming obstacles between herself and the display of James's love. She tried in vain to assure herself that she didn't feel guilty, that her heart beat faster not for James, but for poor little Florrie, that if it cost her an effort to look up from a coffee-pot, it was merely because she did not wish to trouble her daughter with the anxieties that destroyed her own appetite. She knew all the same that somewhere in her thoughts, in her actions, she had overstepped an ancient boundary. If she was not yet disloyal, she was running the risk of disloyalty. At any rate, she was allowing herself, unknown to James, a new attitude of mind which, when he came to realize it, he might not share. In a moment James would be there. Mary forced her mind back to the table in front of her, poured herself out some coffee, put in 2 lumps of the sugar she detested, drank it, and then blushed crimson at the proof she found of her own preoccupation. She looked up instinctively, but no one had noticed her. Rosemary was eating bacon. Trent was reading the Times with an air of kindly tolerance. Trent would dearly have loved to be a Unionist, for the Unionist assumption soothed his gentlemanly instincts, but he could not see his way to anything but loss from a protective tariff. Trent dealt in luxuries. If he charged more for his cakes, his customers would eat fewer. He could picture them, in all their plebeian meanness, eyeing the dish and stilling their appetites with the saw that too many sweet things are bad for the teeth. But the article he was reading did not allude to this cause of stumbling, and his complacent smile turned on Mary's uneasiness to a wave of irritation. Why, she asked herself, had she a fool for a son? What was there wrong with him, or with his surroundings, that after 26 years of life, with health, with plenty of money, his mind should have acquired nothing from experience but the simple cunning of an animal? She seemed for the moment to detach herself from Trent, to see him as coolly as though she were not his mother, pledged to admire him. His fault, poor youth, was that of being slow to receive impressions. He had will and capacity and application, good qualities that came from within, but the walls of his mind had no windows. His dogmas, his attitudes, he took from the children with whom he had been at school. When Trent was an old man, his spirit would still be that of a little boy in a lower form. Other women congratulated her upon having a son so handsome, with such good brains, who would deign to become his father's right hand and live quietly at home. Other women's sons went into the army at best, or they brushed their hair back from their foreheads and spent money in ways their mothers couldn't approve, or having brains they caused great anxiety by thinking with them. Mary had always pitied the mothers of these young men, but now, with a pang, she realized that beneath their smoothness they might have pitied her, have thanked heaven that their boys were in sticks like poor Mrs. Heyham's. At this point, Trent put down his Times and asked her pleasantly for some more coffee. Mary, as she took his cup, felt a wave of self-reproach. What had happened that she should be bitter like this? He was a good boy, a dear boy, as handsome as possible, and as fond of her, and for his affection she had given him secret content. She was, as a matter of fact, the luckiest woman she knew. She looked across at Rosemary to fortify this feeling, and was rewarded by a pleasant picture. The blue dress the child wore showed the clear tones of her skin and the long lines of her chin and throat. Mary loved Rosemary's chin. There was a soft place underneath it where she had always kissed her when she was a baby. The engagement ring Mary hated was out of sight. That was a pretty thing to have at one's breakfast table. Mary felt that she must talk and be cheerful instead of letting the meal pass in silence. "Have either of you seen your father?" she said, to this end. Rosemary looked up. "He's gone. He had something to see to down at the works. He had breakfast at 8, and he wants your car at 12 as Trent is using his today." To Mary this came as a fresh proof of her own unkindness. Poor James, away working for them all before she was down, gone without a kiss or a goodbye because he was considerate of his sleep, gone without a suspicion that his wife had been criticizing him and practically lying to him. Mary's impulse to talk passed. She was humbled. She hardly felt relieved when she realized that she would not have to face him until a day lay between her and her decease. Meanwhile, Rosemary had come to the end of the table and was bending down to kiss her mother. "Goodbye, darling," she was saying. "I'll be back to dinner on Monday. I'm going for a walk in the meadows with Margaret, you know. I've never seen them. They ought to be lovely in this weather." Mary kissed Rosemary and Trent frowned. Trent did not approve of girls going for walks by themselves. At least, if she let them go, Mary should have spoken a word of caution. Rosemary saw the frown and left the room with a cheerful smile. Mary followed her. It had not been at all a cozy breakfast. When she went into her room, she found that Miss Percival, that perfect young woman, was already waiting. "There's something I want you to say," Mary told her, and showed her Florrie's letter. Miss Percival read the letter slowly, without moving the muscles of her face. Then she gave it back. "I'm afraid it looks like the usual thing," she said in a voice that took the place of a shrug. This cynicism affected Mary painfully. "The car is coming in a minute," she said with a grave look. "I thought we had better go to Exeter Street at once and see what has happened for ourselves. I have looked up your notes, and I see that Florrie Wilson is living with an invalid mother who is a widow with some means of her own. She said that her mother is a lady, but I expect that was only her way of saying that they had seen better days. Or it might just be her idea of good form," suggested Miss Percival. "One has, after all, in Florrie's walk of life, to be one's own college of heralds." Mary looked surprised. Then she retired to put on her hat and ponder a sentence that clashed with her notions of Miss Percival. Number 100 Exeter Street was a dirty little house in a dirty and depressing street. The few inches of garden in front of it were ornamented with two large white shells and various old tin cans. Its windows were shut, and as much light as possible kept out by torn lace curtains. It did not look like the house of one whose acquaintance with better days had been at all intimate. Mary would not let the chauffeur ring the bell. She could not be as sure of his manners as of her own, and she waited with Miss Percival for several minutes before anyone in the house responded to her gentle call. Then the door opened a little, and they could see a strip of a woman with bright red cheeks. She stared at the two visitors suspiciously, then she stared with more interest at the car. Finally, when Mary had asked her twice whether Florrie was in, she replied that they could go upstairs if they liked, and saying, "Top landing, back room," she shuffled along the passage in front of them and disappeared down the stairs that led to the others of the basement. Mary dismissed the car, since James wanted it, and went into the house. She wished to think well of Florrie, but as she climbed the 2 flights of stairs, she was assailed by a doubt as to whether Florrie could be a truthful girl. She had said that she lived with her mother in a nice little house, and here she was, apparently a lodger in a house of stairs where the stalest Mary had ever smelled, and kept by a most disagreeable-looking woman. Mary knocked at the door of the back room on the top floor, and a voice that was not Florrie's told them to come in. For a moment, when they were inside, Mary thought that they must have made a mistake, for as she turned towards the window, she saw a bed in which a stout woman was sitting, a shawl over her shoulders, and some work in her hands. The stout woman, however, seemed to expect her. "You've come for my Florrie," she said politely. "She'll be back in a minute. Do sit down, ma'am. Florrie was expecting you, and she's got the room straight, and she didn't think, being gentry, you'd be here so soon." Mary stared at her for a moment. She was fascinated. The woman's face was not stout. It was puffy, livid, swollen. It cost her an effort to say thank you and to find herself a chair. There were only 2 chairs in the room. Mary took the sound one, and Miss Percival the one with a hole in its seat. Meanwhile, Mrs. Wilson continued to address them, but as she spoke bitterness overtook her, and her voice reverted to its natural sharpness. "She's gone round to Merces's," she went on. "She seems to have some maggot in her head about its not being safe. I tell her it's safe enough for too safe, and we shall be lucky if every stick we got ain't safe the same way soon. So she goes and looks in the window to see if it's out for sale." Mrs. Wilson's words gathered speed, and her crochet hook jerked rapidly backwards and forwards. "To lose a good place like that, ma'am, with me dependent on her, when she might have married a gentleman too. And look at us now. Where are we? With her character gone and nothing put by for the rent. It isn't as if I could do anything with me health for me bad, and the pain keeping me awake all night, so I don't sleep a wink. And there's no market for crushing now, along of them niggers." Mrs. Wilson's shawl heaved, showing glimpses of pink flannelette. Mary was puzzled. "But what is it that has happened?" she said. "I don't understand. This Mrs. and what has Florrie done? And I thought you and she had money of your own that you lived on. Money your husband left you." Mrs. Wilson's reply was not coherent, but Mary gathered that Wilson had never left nothing to nobody but worry and trouble. What money Mrs. Wilson had, she made a shilling or 2 a week. It would be when the Turks allowed one to make anything. Further, Florrie had lost her place, owing to a bracelet and to a man she never ought to have had nothing to do with. And Mrs. Wilson had once been second housemaid in a very good house, where she had been very differently brought up to what girls were nowadays. The end of this explanation was confused by large tears which rolled down the poor woman's distorted face and needed to be wiped away with the corner of the blanket. Mary tried to express a reassuring interest while she turned her eyes lightly from this intimate and unpleasant misery. Mrs. Wilson mustn't distress herself. Mary was only there to see what could be done. She would find some way out. There could be no doubt about it. It was only a question of taking courage for an hour or so. If Miss Percival had not been there, Mary might have gone across to the creature who was sobbing so wretchedly, so grotesquely, on the bed, but her volition was paralyzed by the thought of Miss Percival alert to take everything down. She looked round her, waiting uncomfortably for some lull in the snorts and groans which were shaking the opposite corner of the room, and tried in this interval of inaction to collect her impressions and to clear her mind. The one thing up to this point that admitted no doubt was that poor little Florrie, whatever else she might be, was also a liar. She had deceived Mary, and Mary could not help feeling that she had also deceived Mrs. Black. James selected his managers with care. He would not have put Mrs. Black into the position she held unless she could be trusted to keep the firm's most important regulations. Very well then, Florrie must have obtained her own post under false pretences. That legal phrase, slipping unbidden into Mrs. Heyham's mind, seemed to shed an even deeper gloom over the affair. But as she examined the room where Florrie lived, while the primitive woe of Florrie's mother offended her ears, Mary's hatred of deceit became less uncompromising. It was a small room, and the stains made by damp on the walls and ceiling were freshly reinforced. The window was small and shut, and some torn muslin was held across its lower half by a sagging tape. There was a varnished table in the middle of the floor, a cupboard at one end of it, and a packing case by the fireplace covered with odds and ends of bedroom china. The wallpaper was yellowish-brown, and on the mantelpiece there were some ancient ornaments and 2 scarlet paper fans. It was in a place in its dreary stuffiness where ascetic virtues would make a strong appeal. Mary began to understand why Florrie, armed for the conquest of life by a becoming cap and apron, had invented this romance of a lady mother. She felt that even she herself would have needed something to shield her from the realities of such a home. She scanned the room again for traces of the girl's presence. Florrie's best hat hung on a nail on the wall, and a petticoat hung beneath it, but Mary could see no signs of any other bed. It was some moments before she realized, with a sense of shock, that pretty Florrie slept in the bed in the corner side by side with the deceased woman who had bad nights. This was hideous. It was revolting. Nothing in the world could make it right. Mary shivered with the intensity of her repugnance. A sudden picture of Rosemary came into her mind. The 2 girls were the same age, and what gulfs lay between Rosemary and such contact with corruption. She turned her eyes again to the shameful bed, drawn by the fascination of her own horror. She saw then what her agitation had not let her notice, that Miss Percival had left her seat and was bending over Mrs. Wilson. Miss Percival's reserve had gone. For a moment, as she stood motionless, her shadowed face revealed a conquering passion. Its wide eyes, staring across the room, saw nothing. She was shaken by an emotion that closed the venues of sense. Then, as Mary's surprise was growing into wonder, the drawn muscles queued and relaxed, and Miss Percival turned, with a swift movement of pity, to slip her arm round and huddle the woman on the bed. "Poor mother," she said, stroking the swollen hands. "Don't cry, my dear, don't cry. You're not alone now. We're going to stand by your Florrie and help her face the trouble. You mustn't be too hard on her. She's a good girl, you know. See how well she looks after you and how clean she keeps the room. A great many girls wouldn't do that with the hard day's work she has. She may have done wrong, poor tired little thing. The world's too hard for us all sometimes. But think how pretty she is, and how bright, and how she's stuck by you and stood up for you. Why, she won't even have it that you're poor and ill. She always tells people what a fine mother she has, a lady she said you were, and that's because she's fond of you. and won't have others look down on you." Mrs. Wilson could not have heard half of these rapid words, but they succeeded in changing the current of her thoughts. Her moans ceased. Mary saw her pull the shawl together across her chest and turn to the young woman stooping over her. "Pretty?" she said earnestly. "She's as pretty as the summers day, my Florrie is. Their man's been after her ever since she left school. It's a wonder to me she's kept straight the way she has. But she should have known." Here the unhappy creature was shaken by fresh sobs. "As that swine wasn't of no good with its diamond bracelet. What would be giving a diamond bracelet for? A dirty little girl like him stands to reason." Miss Percival smoothed back the hair that hung over the woman's face. "So Florrie took his bracelet, did she?" she asked softly. "But why did she lose her place? Was he a customer? If that's all, I'm sure we can put it right." But Florrie's mother did not seem able to answer. She covered her face with her hands and bent over her matted blanket. Miss Percival seemed to think it enough that she was crying more quietly, for she said no more, but stood, still with her arm round Mrs. Wilson's shoulder, looking steadily at the wall. Mary, if she had been alone, could have hidden her own face in her hands for self-contempt. She was the leader in this adventure, she was the mother, she, the woman of age and experience, the woman who had taken credit for keen perceptions and ready sympathy. And here she had sat, hard, cruel, disgusted, shutting out kindness and pity from her heart while a girl, a paid secretary, had taken her place. She had despised these poor creatures because their ugliness and their sin were spread before her. But what of the sin, the deceit, and pride she had been hiding in her own heart? She had despised Trent a few hours ago because his mind was shut to everything that did not accord with itself, and now what was she doing but thrusting out of her own notions, her prejudices and daintiness to shield her from the suffering that came with the knowledge of suffering? It was nothing unusual that was happening here. It was unusual to her only because she had escaped her share of the world's misery. Mary's conscience was always ready to accept a conviction of sin. But after a time even Mary sought for relief, as she sat stiffly on her chair, her head bent, her hands clasped. Rigid with the pain of thought, a little quick idea ran across her mind. The Insurance Act. She caught at it, embraced it with relief. 5 shillings a week for life, meant for such cases as this. Her own housekeeping cost her £50 a week, but just now her mind was tuned to a different scale. She smiled, she raised her head, leaned forward hopefully. "Miss Percival, what about the Insurance Act? Couldn't we get Mrs. Wilson into an approved society? She ought to be getting disablement benefit." The sound of her employer's voice made Miss Percival start. She had not been thinking about the Insurance Act. When she looked round to face Mary's fearful expression, she did not look as if her thoughts had been pleasant. "Mrs. Wilson is not an employed person," she said, as briefly as if she had been speaking to a fool. "And anyway, no society would take her with her health like this." Then she turned back to the wall with her look of dislike accentuated. Mrs. Wilson, who had been recovering, groaned feebly. Mary flushed and then leaned back again. She would accept this now, but she must think it over. She could see now that the Insurance Act would not help Mrs. Wilson, but that was only an accident, a matter of dates. It would help the Mrs. Wilsons of the future. Her mind felt eased. She wished she knew more about the Act. She was resolving to buy a sixpenny book about it when her honesty reminded her uncomfortably that there was little to ease her mind in an Act which she had done nothing to bring about, an Act of which she hadn't, as a matter of fact, approved. She had obeyed the law, but she felt that it was hard on the servants. She wished she could feel sure that poor Florrie had obeyed the law. The room was quiet now. Mrs. Wilson had stopped crying, and Mary's mind, confused by the unaccustomed nature of the facts presented to it and their incompleteness, wandered foolishly between the problem of her own responsibility for the distress of the poor and the probable nature of Florrie's offence. She was also harassed by a recurring recognition of the stuffiness of the room. She had decided vaguely that there must always be rich and poor because there isn't enough money to go round, though we ought to do more than we do, and also that Miss Percival was probably right and Florrie had been detected taking presents from customers when Florrie came in. Mary did not recognize her for an instant. The figure in the doorway lacked the good looks of the girl at Chelsea. Then she saw that Florrie was merely looking shabby and ill. "Good morning, my dear," she said, resolved now, at least, to do more than her duty. "Glad you have come back." Florrie came forward into the middle of the room. Her expression, Mary thought, was almost sullen. She jerked her head towards her mother. "She told you?" she asked. "Nothing that I could understand. Your mother is very unhappy, Florrie." "That you may well say, ma'am, me own daughter treating me like this," added Mrs. Wilson, who had assumed an air of self-righteousness and freed herself from the shelter of Miss Percival's arm. Mary spoke hastily to interrupt her. "I'm sure you would prefer to tell us yourself." Florrie took off her hat and put it down on the table. Then she arranged the tips of her fingers in a neat line along a crack in the wood. Finally, without looking up, she began to speak. "He's been following me home every night for the last month," she said. "Time again I've asked him not to, and I've tried to run away from him, and once I took the bus, but he knew I couldn't go on with that. And none of the others don't come any my way. And he's offered me everything you can think of, jewels and chocolates, and take me to the theatre, and a glance silk dress, and I wouldn't take one because I saw what he was after, the dirty beast. And I never had no drinks with him, only once an ice off a barrel. There was four. I knew him well, and I've cried in the street. I've been wild with him. He knew I had no one could do anything to him. He's called at the house even, and told her downstairs I'd invited him. Me and white fellows up here." Florrie looked up at this. Her eyes were red. She did not go on for a minute. Her hands were trembling, though she was pressing them against the table to keep them still. The silence was broken by Mrs. Wilson. Mrs. Wilson seemed excited. She was leaning forward, her shawl dragged tightly round her shoulders, nodding eagerly at each of Florrie's phrases. "Don't you stop, Florrie," she said. "You tell the ladies, me girl. Just you tell them what he's done." Florrie looked slowly at her mother, then turning away, she told them. Then one day he came and said I'd broken his heart, and he were going away, and I should never see him again. And he brought me a parting gift, and when I had taken it, he'd go, not before. And I was that bucked at getting rid of him, I was fool enough to take it. It was a diamond bracelet in a real leather case. And he said goodbye, and would I think of him sometimes, and I said not if I could help it, and we parted. And mother having been so bad, I took it straight round to Moses's that night. I suppose he must have followed me, for he waited a day or two till I had spent the money, and there he was at the corner wanting to know if I were ready to do my part of the bargain. I told him there were no bargain, told him I wouldn't go with him for 100 diamond bracelets, and then he said—" She stopped again. "You go on, you say it, darling." Mrs. Wilson's excitement was growing. "He said I'd stolen it, and if I didn't give it back, he would have me put away." After that, nobody spoke for a moment. Mary was trembling. Miss Percival was white. Mrs. Wilson looked from one to the other of them, nodding her head with an air almost of triumph. Then Mary remembered that there was more to hear. "My dear," she said quickly, "my poor little girl, you mustn't trouble about that. We'll get the bracelet back, and if you like we'll call it a loan and you can return it when you have the money." Mary did not want to crush Florrie with a sense of obligation. "But how was it that you lost your place? Did the man tell his story to the manager?" Florrie stood quite still and did not answer. Mary waited for a minute and then glanced across at Mrs. Wilson. The invalid had assumed a piteous expression. She looked back mysteriously and shook her head. But when, after a considerable silence, Florrie still did not speak, she could bear the silence no longer, and she turned upon her daughter. "Now then," she admonished her, "you tell them. Don't you go shaking the hard part. If the ladies is to help us, they must know the whole truth." She looked at Mary for approval. Florrie, whose attention had been caught by her mother's tone, saw the glance. "Well then, I won't tell them," she cried. "I'm not going to. Tell them yourself as you seem to enjoy it." She flung herself into Miss Percival's chair, her face turned away from them over its back, and Mary could see that her shoulders were shaking. Mrs. Wilson tried to look shocked. "Well, if she's not got one of her wicked tempers, ma'am, and won't tell you, then I must," she said, though far from enjoying it. "Well, then, you came after her, worrying every day till she felt desperate, as she must get the money, so that I should have to say. She tried to see if some keys we had would unlock the box where Mrs. Black keeps the silver. And not only they wouldn't, but Mrs. Black catches her at it, so of course she couldn't see her way to keeping her. So now she's lost her place and no character. Any foot on the stair may be the police, and we have had nothing to eat but a cup of tea since yesterday at dinner time, and the rent owing, and the Lord have mercy on us, for I don't know what we ought to do." So that was it. Florrie was a thief. An hour ago Mary would have been shocked by this. Now she was angry, giddy with anger. This world in which she had been happy for so long had become intolerable, and Mary resented it. It was monstrous that these things should happen, and that no one should care. Mary's indignation consumed all thought of guilt or care of responsibility. She turned to Miss Percival with a decision which the morning had not yet found in her. "What are we to do?" she said. "They must have something to eat, and I suppose we'd better get back that bracelet without loss of time." Miss Percival agreed. "I wish," she added, "that we could get hold of the man." Mary shivered. To face a man like that was more, she thought, than she could do. Then she went over to Florrie. "My dear," she said, "if you'll put on your hat and show us where the bracelet is, we'll get it back for you, and we must bring a pie or something for your dinner." Mary had a vague feeling that poor people generally eat pork pies for dinner. Florrie stood up. She looked stupid, as though she did not quite understand. "He's outside," she said. "Followed me home." Mary was startled. She could hardly believe that the unspeakable evil thing was so close. "He won't hurt you when we are with you," she told Florrie, but her heart beat faster. The girl put on her hat, and they left the room without another thought of Mrs. Wilson. She was lying back against a pillow, her swollen face pale and distorted, and she did not speak. When they reached the street, Mary looked round her fearfully, almost as though she had a sense of guilt. She felt as if she were taking a furtive peep at an indecent picture. There was no one near the garden gate of number 100, but some way off on the other side of the street a man was leaning wearily against a lamp-post. "That's him," said Florrie. "He'll follow us, you see." They turned off down the street, and Mary knew for the first time the choking excitement of the chase. She would not look round to see whether the man was following. Every instinct forbade it, but she could not help wishing that Florrie would do it for her. This did not seem likely. Florrie's eyes were fixed far ahead, and every line of her shoulders expressed an unyielding singleness of purpose. It was extraordinary that she did not seem to mind whether the man were there or not. Even the bold Miss Percival was looking at the ground. Mary's nervousness increased. He might, for all they knew, be quite close to them. Finally, at a corner, she found that she had looked round without meaning to. The man was there, about 20 paces behind. He was little and young and fair and very unhappy, not at all red, gross creature he ought to have been, and that Mary had expected. She caught the rest of the distance in a tumult of nerves that did not allow her to see where she was going. It was only as they entered the door of a shop that she made an effort to recover her self-command. This, of course, must be the pawnbroker's. Mary had never been into a pawn shop before, and she expected to find it an interesting place. It was not. Neither the empty counter before them nor the walls of the compartment that hemmed them in presented any features of interest. The young man behind the counter was not even, as it happened, a Jew. Meanwhile, Florrie, trembling and intense, had produced her ticket. The young man took it in a perfectly ordinary way. Mary realized suddenly that he was accustomed to pawn tickets. 35 bob, he said. Mary looked at him with astonishment. She would hardly have been surprised if he had asked for so many pounds. Florrie at her side gave a little soft sob of agonized suspense. Florrie was wondering whether it was too much. Mary put back the cheque-book she had been innocently taking from her bag and brought out the necessary money. As she put it on the counter, Florrie caught hold of Miss Percival's arm to steady herself. The assistant was gone now, and the shop was spinning round Florrie in circles of yellow light. There was a fine dancing halo, especially obscuring the door through which he had disappeared. He was not away long, and when he came back he was unwrapping a little parcel. Florrie, shaking all over, held out her hand for it. Inside the parcel was a leather case. The young man, as he handed it to Mary, opened it. There lay the bracelet. Not even a lady, Florrie felt, could deny its glories. It was a golden snake with a beautiful pattern of scales on its back, and in his eyes there sparkled 2 small diamonds. "A pretty thing," said the young man in a sociable tone. "Real gold, 9 carat." Before he had finished, Florrie was out of the shop, and Mary was obliged to follow her without replying. It was a corner shop, and Florrie had turned into the little side street instead of the busier way by which they had come. As Mary came out, she saw that the fair young man was staring into the window of a tobacconist next door. When he saw Florrie coming, he hesitated and then stepped forward to meet her with a nervous smile. "So you've got it." He was beginning, but she did not let him finish. "Take that, you mug," she said, and threw it at him. Then she turned her back on him with a laugh of triumph. The little man did not seem to have felt the leather case which had hit him on the chin. For a moment he stood still, staring after Florrie, then suddenly he pulled his scarf across his eyes. "She's gone," he said to himself, and when he raised his head, Mary, disgusted, could see that he was crying. The little man did not mind Mary. He cried for a little and wiped his eyes again, and then stooped to pick up the bracelet that had fallen out of the case at his feet. He did not look at it, but slipped it into his pocket, and then walked away down the street, still sniffing. He was a miserable little man. Mary morally felt sorry for him. She was recalled to more fitting sentiments by Miss Percival's voice in her ear. "Don't you think Florrie had better have something to eat at once?" she said urgently. "She's hysterical." Mary agreed, and they moved away to an eating-house known to Florrie. The interior of the eating-house, unlike the pawn shop, was full of interest, but Mary forgot to study the people seated at its tables, nor did she drink the milk which, to put Florrie at her ease, she had ordered for herself and Miss Percival. She was very much puzzled by the fair young man. He ought to have shown forth his wickedness on his face. He ought to have filled Mary's soul with a shudder of loathing, and he had not. She had meant to banish the subject as quickly as possible from Florrie's mind, but she could not help, when Florrie had finished her soup, asking her a few questions. "Why couldn't he have offered to marry you, my dear?" she said. "Is he married?" Florrie was feeling better now. She put her spoon down neatly like a lady and answered with some of her old deference. No, he's not married, ma'am, but he's a gentleman. He's a merchant in his father's office and he lives at home and gets £1 a week. His father would have turned him out if he had married me. Oh, he would have, he told me so, but I wouldn't never have married him. He wasn't my sort. Her attention wavered to the sausages which the waiter was putting before her. This composed reply added to Mary's discomfort. If the villain who had tried to wreck Florrie's soul lived on £1 a week, he must have saved up to buy the bracelet. Or perhaps he hadn't paid for it. Perhaps he wanted to take it back to the shop himself. Mary couldn't believe that feeble little man would ever have prosecuted Florrie. She reminded herself that he hadn't been too feeble, all the same, to drive the poor child to stealing. What a horrible tangle it was! She left the table hastily and went to the counter, where she bought eggs and sandwiches for Mrs. Wilson. She realized that she was more or less in charge of Mrs. Wilson, and suddenly she felt very tired. But Mrs. Wilson's future was a burden that Mary was to be spared. When they arrived on the doorstep of number 100, they found the landlady was in the hall waiting for them. She was of full importance, of mystery, almost of triumph. She addressed herself to Florrie. "Your ma's been took bad," she said. "Just after you got out, I heard a shriek as it happened, and I sent for the doctor. But it weren't no good, and the poor thing were gone before he came. It's a miracle she lived so long," he said. Mary was conscious of a great relief. End of chapter 6.